Hi, everyone. Just getting set up, so welcome. And as that's happening, we welcome you. Looks like we're getting started on Facebook and also on YouTube. So let's hope that that's starting to show up. Looks like it is. That's great. Welcome, everyone. Good. Let me get the mutes off so we're not having any feedback. Welcome. Okay. Welcome. Welcome to, I think this is like the 6th class of prayer mastery. So it might even be the 7th class. And for those who have been joining all along, we have explored a variety of subjects that are pertaining to some of the fundamental questions and concerns about Jewish prayer. We started with why pray and how do you pray Jewishly and what are the things that one would pray for in Judaism and what are the prerequisites of that kind of activity and also the challenges that come with that activity, which is something that we're going to focus on tonight. Because there are words in the book that don't always resonate with our sensibilities, sometimes even vehemently opposing our sense of diversity and respect for all forms of humanity, that the particularity that sometimes can be expressed through Jewish prayer can be understood to be as a limitation or an exclusion of others. And we're going to focus on that idea in addition to some of the other theological conundrums that come out in the prayer book. And while we can sit here in the dawning of the 21st century and say that these are challenges that are totally anew for us. We might even say that because we're in a time of tremendous upheaval, not only socially, but technologically, and not only because we're living in this extremely unique moment of a pandemic and our response to that pandemic, that we are reacting with a different set of principles, a different set of rules about what it is that we ought to be doing. So if that were the case, then opening up the book and trying to read the prayers and connect to them would be frustrating and disappointing, and it would force us in some ways to kind of close the book altogether. So tonight we're going to spend a little bit of time focusing on that. What do we do with the prayers that we don't agree with? How do we understand prayers that we don't agree with? And not only challenge why they perhaps currently still reside in our Siddur, the book, which is the collection, the compilation of Jewish prayer throughout the millennia, but also it challenges us. What is our authority? What is our right to adjust, to reinterpret, to reimagine the meaning of prayers if this is something that has been tested and has been transmitted and has been protected throughout the generations? Is it something a bit of arrogance or hubris on our part to say that the prayers don't speak to us and so therefore we should just throw them out of the book and return to something that seems a little bit more palatable to us? While all of those things are kind of happening simultaneously, the real challenge is what you're doing in the middle of your moment of prayer. For tonight, it's easy for us to talk about all of the things that we feel we don't agree with or the theologies that we want to wrestle with, which help us kind of grapple and understand the meaning of the prayers themselves. But in the midst of prayer itself, when you're flipping the page and all of a sudden you get to a place that you are uncomfortable with, perhaps that's diplomatic, you downright disagree with, what do you do? So I imagine that 3 possible responses are available to us. The first one is you just throw the whole thing out. This prayer means nothing to me. It doesn't exist. I don't agree with it. And so therefore, I'm going to throw it away. The second one is to reinterpret it. And that's also something that we've grappled with and dealt with, just like we've dealt with the first one. And that's the sense that, well, we might understand the words in a particular way because that's the way that they're written, but there's a deep metaphor that we're meant to explore in the words. And when we can build that interpretive layer over the words themselves, something that might on the surface seem or feel impalatable is something that actually is very worthy of our meditation and our reflection and our expression in this modern idiom. So that's the second. And the third one is something that I also think we find in our tradition, which is to write a new prayer altogether. So you're flipping the page and you get to the place where you see something that represents some idea that is perhaps from a generation gone by. Maybe it's the restoration of sacrifices. Maybe it's the role of women. Maybe it's the idea of God's divine intervention in the behaviors of humanity throughout history. Whatever those questions that you have when you're flipping through the Siddur and attempting to make connections with your own sense of spirituality, those things may prompt you to write new words in that moment. And that too has been an example of something that we have done throughout our days. So tonight we're going to focus on those three ideas. What do we do with prayers that we don't agree with? And how has our tradition or how has modernity responded to them? And we're going to learn from them. Tonight, just so you know, there are many, many, many examples of this. Too many examples to teach in a 45 to 55-minute class. But I'll try to refer to a couple of them. But I've chosen to focus on three particular prayers. The three particular prayers that I'm choosing to discuss tonight are the second paragraph of the Shema, and we'll understand why that is a controversial text and what perhaps prompts conflict or discomfort with people when they read it. And then the second one is the Amidah, in which we added the matriarchs into the prayer, coming from a congregation that is very comfortable, has adapted with great ease the interpretation of the matriarchs into the traditional prayers. We're also a community that doesn't always use those words. And so there's sometimes, at least in our daily minions, sometimes the words are used and sometimes the words are not used. And what does it mean to kind of have prayer publicly and personally, which sort of holds both? The third part is the Aleinu. Now the Aleinu, as we understand it, has a part that has, that at one point was included in the prayer, but it was removed deliberately. And a little bit of that was historical and what was prompting of that. And what we're going to study is what prompted the liturgist to remove that line and what is left in its wake. What is the theological proposition that we have to contend with without that one extra line? So that's what we're going to study tonight. And I welcome you to Prayer Mastery. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. We're glad to learn with you. As we said, this is the 6th or 7th of our classes, and we have a few more classes before we conclude this series of learning together. Okay, so let's open up our text for tonight. And let's see if we get it. Okay, looks like we're here. So I've entitled this Words That Hurt, Words That Heal. And the reason that I've entitled it Words That Hurt and Words That Heal is because I think in the midst of prayer, while it's not a physical blemish or a physical act of harm, it's an emotional, it's a spiritual harm that comes to us. And prayer demands a certain vulnerability. And in that vulnerability, words that are incongruous with our feelings can be hurtful. Of course, we need to sort of develop a thicker skin as we make our way in the world, because any sort of word that doesn't perhaps synergize with our feelings could be hurtful. There's a wonderful lecture to have at another point in time about the growing generation of these first years of the 21st century that are incredibly affected by this concept of a vulnerable self that is easily threatened by words that come from the outside. And that is an interesting subject. But for our purposes tonight, what we're talking about is the idea that we're in a vulnerable place trying to express something from our souls. And as we're doing that, which requires an intellectual effort and an emotional effort, that intellectual understanding of the prayers themselves is complicated at best. Like I've said, it's sometimes downright odious, because it reflects something that is completely antithetical to our understanding of the current sociological moment in which we live. And that concept not only is felt now, but it's something that we project into the future. Someone should never say something like that. There should never be a circumstance where we would talk this way. And knowing that our prayers have a reflection of something that was expressed in the past, but is not resonant with us in the present, is our conflict about whether or not to project it into the future. So let's begin with this concept of the opposite, right? Words that heal. Okay, there are words that hurt and there are words that heal. And I grabbed this from a 20th century Dutch minister. His name was Henri Nouwen, and he writes a beautiful reflection on this. One of the main tasks of theology is to find words that do not divide but unite, that do not create conflict but unity, that do not hurt but heal. So that idea that that we're seeking not words of division, but words that heal and bring us together, that unite us, that is one of the core and fundamental tasks of prayer, but also sort of our humanity, is important to hold on to, because Jewish prayer doesn't always reflect that universal essence, even though it is very much in there. And we'll come back to that idea a little bit later in our text when we talk about the Aleinu prayer, which is particularistic and universal in the conflict that resides with the two. So Mark, my friend, hello, writing. It's good to see you. This is not being broadcast on Zoom, so we welcome you, and I hope that you are enjoying it with YouTube. And please, very much, if you have any comments or you have any contributions, go ahead and chat them in the chat box. The same thing is true with anybody who is on our YouTube page, which is great. So I see some comments. Can I make the page larger? Yes. And Aleinu is where it says yes. So we've got those things. And shalom, Heather. So nice to see you. And shalom, Joy, from the other side of the valley. It's great to have you. So I'm going to make the text bigger now. Give me a second. Okay. Okay, hopefully that looks a lot better. So now, let's read. What I did is I have the 3 parts of the Siddur just in translation, just for you to understand what they are, okay? All right, so this is the second paragraph of the Shema. Let's read it for a moment. Welcome other folks that have participated and wrote comments. It's nice to see you, Bert. Welcome. I'm glad that you're joining with us. Yes, that's a fantastic book, by the way, okay? Wonder how I grabbed that. Okay, now, the second paragraph of the Shema says this in English. If then you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving God and serving God with all your heart and soul, I, says God, will grant rain for your land in season, the early rain and the late. You shall gather in the new grain and wine and oil, and I shall provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and thus you shall eat your fill. So this is one of the sort of great sort of religious contracts, okay? This is a conditional, a covenantal contract. God says, if you follow the mitzvot, then I'm going to benefit you with rain and with wine and grain and all the good things in the world, okay? And thus you will eat your fill, which is a wonderful word. Ve'achalta v'savata, it says in Hebrew. You're going to eat and you're going to be satisfied. So it's not like you're just having a protein shake and you ate it and for a moment you're satisfied, or Chinese food, right? And you ate it and you were really full and then an hour later you're hungry. No. This is the best Chinese food ever. You ate it and you were satisfied for hours and upon hours because God blessed it. Okay, not the pork, but everything else. Take care not to be lured away to serve other gods and bow to them. For God's anger will flare up against you, shutting up the sky so that there will be no rain and the ground will not yield its produce, and you will soon perish from the good land that God is assigning you. Therefore, impress my words upon your very heart, bind them as a sign upon your hand, let them serve as a symbol on your forehead, and teach them to your children, reciting them when you stay at home and when you're away, when you lie down and when you get up, and inscribe them on your gates to the end that you and your children may endure in the land God has swore your fathers to assign to them, as long as there is a heaven over the earth. So every single morning and every single evening, twice a day, these are words that we are commanded to recite. So we recite the commandment to love God, v'ahavta. We've spoken about that earlier in some of our classes. Tonight, we're talking about the second paragraph, which is the conditional relationship. If you follow the mitzvot, I'll give you blessings. If you don't follow the mitzvot, I'm going to spit you out on the land and you are going to suffer. So this is the language of Deuteronomy. Okay, it's a very well-known theology of early ancient Israel. And it was actually a predominant theology in Israel for many, many, many years. And it's something that we continue to contend with today, right? So much so we would say, why don't we just take this paragraph out, right? Who believes in a world that if you do good things, God will reward you, and if you do bad things, God will punish you? Even though we want to believe that, we want to believe that the reason for doing the right thing is that God will give us a reward, not the reward that we receive from other people, but God will give us a reward. And that's why we should do good things. The problem with that is that there are wicked that succeed and there are good people that suffer. And as soon as you start to get into that theological problem, they call it theodicy. Why do good people suffer? And why do bad people succeed? Because as the rabbis have said over many, many years, have debated with this, there's something about the nature of human being and the nature of humanity that even God does not have the power to influence and control. So this idea that God controls us with our good behavior or God controls us with our bad behavior is something that could be very problematic for us. Now we're going to talk in just a minute about how we're going to deal with that, but this is one of those problematic paragraphs. And if you're not challenged by this, well, then I invite you to read it a little bit deeper, and I'm sure that you have some ways of figuring it out, and I look forward to hearing your contributions. Hold on to them for a minute. I'm going to present the two other texts that we're going to study tonight, and then we'll stop and take some comments, questions, and contributions, okay? All right. Now, the second thing that we're going to study is from the opening paragraph of the Amidah. So 3 times a day and all holidays, we stand up and we recite these words in order for us to enter into prayer with God. And when we say them, according to tradition, it's Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. We are praying to the God. Praised are you, the one who was the one in relationship with our spiritual forefather Abraham, his son Isaac, and his grandson Jacob. And because God had written, if you will, proven relationships and connections with those people who we termed the patriarchs, therefore we are humbly permitted to beseech God's presence, to beseech God's assistance with us and our needs. So that has a very compelling message. There are matriarchs. About 40 years ago, the question emerged, which 40 years ago is also a significant time in the history of humanity. It's only think about 40, 50 years ago, right? 50 years ago was really the sort of like apex of liberation for women's movement. And the idea that, that this is still a very new phenomenon, the idea that women were absolutely excluded from the prayer language of our Siddur. In other words, if you were a woman and you wanted to pray to God, you had to pray to God, who was the God of the ancestors, the men. And they were the ones who also were subjugating you and limiting you and gave you very narrow definitions of your behavior. So if you are a woman, I can imagine being extremely upset, perhaps disappointed, and even enervated by the words of prayer which don't speak to you and your soul and your heart. So about, like I said, 40 years ago, things kind of began to emerge, and there were early adopters of this idea that said, no, 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 no. First of all, we are an enlightened generation. We recognize that the role of women is deserving of equal status as the role of men. And if we're going to stand in prayer, then we also have to be able to express prayers which represent that equivalence. And even more so, there are matriarchs, matronly figures, women figures in the Bible who are worthy of celebration, who are worthy of recognition, who are worthy of connection because their own relationship with God was something that we can also access to connect to the God that we seek to be in presence of. And that's why slowly but surely, and in the conservative movement, really only in the 80s and 90s did it ultimately become an addition to the prayer book, which was ultimately codified as what we called the Imahot. Blessed are you who remembers the valor of mothers. This is, as you see, I just grabbed it, right? This is, so this is Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, right? This is also all of those matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, all of the wives of the patriarchs. And you visit their children's children with the reward of their work in love. Blessed are you who visit Sarah, okay? And that's Baruch Atanai Ufoked Sarah, or Magen Avraham Ufoked Sarah. There are some renditions of this in the Siddur that say Ve'ezrat Sarah, who served as the supporter of Sarah. And both of those have biblical connections, just like Magen Avraham is something that is connected biblically in the construction of the Siddur. So this is an example of a new prayer that was written. Okay, the first prayer is one that we have to reinterpret. The second prayer is one that we're going to have to rewrite and add anew. And then here's one, the Aleinu prayer, the first paragraph of the Aleinu, which is, as we know, and has already been mentioned, is going to be one of the things that has been removed, taken out of the prayers. Okay. Aleinu l'shabeach, right? It's upon us. We rise to our duty to praise the master of all, to acclaim the creator. God made our lot unlike that of other people, assigning to us a unique destiny. For they worship vanity and emptiness and pray to a God who cannot save. Now, in this rendition that I took out, the parentheses were actually from the English that I grabbed from Sefaria, and they tried to preserve the tradition. Why did they do that? Because there are still some Siddurim that exist today in which in some prayer communities, they leave this line in, okay? Most congregations don't, but there are some places that leave it in. We bend the knee, bow, acknowledging the supreme sovereign, the Holy One exalted, spread out the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth, whose glorious abode is in the loftiest heights. This is our God, there is no other. In truth, God alone is our ruler, as it is written in the Torah. Know this day and take it to heart that Adonai is God in heaven and above, and on earth below, there is no other. And for those of us who were with us last week, Ein Od was a beautiful, beautiful understanding of saying that everything is God. So the idea is that you move in this prayer to say it's up to us as uniquely covenanted human community with God to fulfill our responsibilities. And therefore we bow to God who has given us that responsibility. That's the shorthand of what this paragraph is. Now you might be saying a couple things, which I hope that you are. First of all, that line you say, oh my God, how can we talk about other people that worship vanity and emptiness and pray to a God that cannot save? Who are we to judge? That would be the thing. And even if we were to judge, why would we be in the middle of our prayers judging other people? That's question one. Second thing is, wait a minute. This is the 21st century. I mean, we just finished weeks and weeks. We are suffering for the consequences of raising up our voices and taking the streets and recognizing yet again and still again that even in the 21st century, there are those among us who do not receive equal treatment. Here based on the color of their skin, they're based on their economic status, they're based on their religious beliefs, here based on their political identity even. These kinds of things, that reality that we are dividing and dividing and dividing does not resonate with our modern sensibility, even though even today there's a problem with that. So what does it mean to say a prayer that acknowledges our particularity, that celebrates our particularity, and then leaves us to say we're the only ones who can praise to God and recognize that, as we get to it a little later, obviously we need the second paragraph, because the second paragraph gives us a lot better sense of what this is all about. All right, let me stop for a second, because I noticed that already we've excited everybody's interest here, and you have so many comments, okay? So yes, so Suzanne writes, the Alina prayer where it says, did I make us like others? The Reformed prayer book threw those words out, okay? So that's wonderful, right? You see where it is, but I also have to say, like, if you go into the Mishkan Tefillah, it's a sense, there is a sense that it's still there. And part of it is, that's another challenge, right? Is that we've got this like catchy tune. So, people say the words even though they don't know what it means, because the tune fits, right? And that's why, when you sing the song, you're like, wow, that's such a catchy tune. And then you understand, itsy bitsy spider went up the water spout. Wait a minute, you're like, I'm singing a children's rhyme when I'm praying? No. This can't be. This is my prayer. It's so important. Okay. Mark, I love you, and you have a lot to say tonight. Okay, so prayer, I don't pray to the air, I speak to space, time, or reality, and then I physically feel I'm connected to universal consciousness, echad, as reality. Nice. So Mark shares, I don't know what prompted it, but it's wonderful. Okay, which is to say that oneness, okay, which we spoke about before in last class, but just to continue into this, right? If one of the goals of prayer is to experience unity, unification, yichud is what it is referred to in Hebrew, that we're supposed to have this like divine connection, that divinity or the force and the spirit of everything that animates existence that is within us, we are connected to it. It's beautiful words, that in that moment, that achadut, that connection, that oneness, that when that happens, we know that we have accomplished our goals in prayer. Yes, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing it, and I'm glad that you feel it. And hopefully we have to understand how our words that we're reciting help us get there, right? There's an intellectual journey that needs to take place. There's an emotional journey that needs to take place. And then there's that meditative, spiritual being that needs to take place, okay? So another question about the Amidah, although that's not our subject tonight, asked question about the giving life to the Mechaye HaMetim, right? That's another problematic word. Like, what does that mean? God literally lifts up bones out of the ground, or like, reassembles bodies that have been decimated. It just doesn't make sense. What are we talking about here, right? So clearly we have to enter into the question of metaphor. And that's where I want to spend the next few minutes of our study, is trying to understand, how do we introduce metaphor, and why is metaphor important, and where does metaphor satisfy our need to reinterpret the prayer, and what do we do with, even once we go through a metaphor to understand it and we still don't resonate with it, what shall we do? Okay, so that's where we are. Any other comments, or we're doing okay? Fantastic. Okay, here we go. Let's share. All right. So I said there's three responses: remove, add, or reinterpret. Okay. So actually, my numbering is not great, because I think that number one is number three, right? The one that we're going to read right now is actually all about reinterpretation. Okay. So Marcia Falk is a modern rabbi. She wrote this book called The Book of Blessings, and she was a prolific writer and rewriter of prayers. And it was with her hand that many of the prayers were feminized in a way that was important for us to recognize that even the language that we use, which is meant to be sort of a plurality, multiple genders, that we needed to specify some of our prayer language in the feminine. And it's really interesting, because I haven't spoken to, I don't know where Marcia Falk is in the world these days, but I would be very interested to hear, when we're talking about multiple gender identities, and the acceptance of multiple gender identities, which we have today, what language ought we use? And I think that that's the sort of like emerging question about language in general. But nonetheless, in the 90s and previously, she was on the vanguard of bringing the feminine voice to prayer. So she writes, to me, kavanah, intention in prayer, means meaning what you say. Okay, so we've learned that before, right? Make your ear hear what your mouth utters. Say what you mean and mean what you say. Sounds like a Popeye comment. I can't have kavanah with words that are inappropriate. Okay, so she's like, I love this. She was kind of a renegade by saying this statement. Right? So much of us are deferential. We treat the Siddur like the Sefer Torah. The Sefer Torah is immutable, and we feel and believe that therefore the Siddur is immutable too. And there's lots of historical understanding, which we'll get to in the last reading that we have tonight. But the idea that you could come out right and say, it's inappropriate, right? There's stuff that I just don't believe. Many Jews today don't relate to a Lord God, King of the world. I don't know where you are with your own prayer life. I don't know whether this is a challenge that you confront and you're just either ignoring it, or you've contended with it and you've created a new understanding, or you've done something like what Marcia Falk does and you've feminized it to make it a little bit more sort of resonant with your sensibility. And whether it's a feminine language or it's a multi-gendered language or it's actually a different language altogether of understanding God, right? You rewrite it, you reinterpret it, okay? It doesn't make sense for us to be praying as if we did. That's what I love. Think about the second paragraph of the Shema. The idea is that when reading the words of Shema, you would say, I'm going to read this because it's as if God rewards us for good deeds and punishes us for bad deeds, right? It doesn't make sense to do that. Like, what a lie that we would have to live. What a lie it would be for you to sit in a prayer community and to enter into prayer and to know that as we're going through the pages, not only are you trying to keep pace, not only are you trying to express the words along with the melodies, not only are you trying to get the meaning of the words on the surface, but then you're supposed to not only make meaning of that, but make a connection to that. And at that moment, you are stifled because you just, once you understand what it means, you can't understand it. Well, it's a failure. It's not your failure. It's a failure of the language. And I would say even more so, it's a failure of our prayer life. So I'm with Marcia Falk in saying that what she says, metaphors have impact. And I think about this when I think about the first paragraph of the Shema. What is the first paragraph of Shema trying to keep? It's trying to keep this idea that our actions have consequences. Take the reward and punishment out of it. And just recognize that what we do has impact. There are so many times when we think, one more bite of ice cream, 5 more minutes of watching TV, a little bit more sleep, I'll call that person tomorrow. Any of those kinds of ideas and attitudes that we cultivate, those are decisions. And not judging them one way or the other, but the accumulation of those decisions can potentially present challenging issues for us. I mean, if you struggle with eating, one more bite of ice cream leads to 2 to 3 to 20. And if you are sleeping a little bit longer, you could develop a sense of depression because too much sleep and a pattern of sleep only begets more sleep, and that's a problem. Or if you decide that you're not going to call that person because maybe you're going to call them tomorrow, you continue to self-isolate yourself. And in this time of self-isolation, that doesn't mean no connection. But if you prevent yourself from being in contact with other people, you willfully do that, then it becomes your problem. And then you could say, wait a minute, I'm reading this paragraph of the Shema again, right? If I do the mitzvot, if I am positive, not positive like happy, but if I am positive, constructive, creative, right, then blessings emerge. And if I don't, then the consequence of those things is the absence of God. There's suffering that comes as a result. I think we can all relate to that. I know I can. So the idea that this is one of those challenges that demands reinterpretation is something that needs to be understood. So I had the text on there. I should have been talking. Bye, Bert. Sorry we missed you. You had to go. And let me just say, oh, good. Joy. Thank you. Joy, you got a lot of stuff. All right, Joy says, I'm not looking for reward up front, but more interest in the bank, right? So her teacher, Reb Zalman, Zichrono Livracha, would say, please God, when I'm at the Holy Gates, please remember all the mitzvot and not where I screwed up, right? So you know what? That's like a beautiful understanding of belief, right? So you could also reinterpret it and say, look, this isn't an immediate understanding of the prayer. That's not what it is. But it actually, what it is it's sort of an accumulation, right? A bank of behavior. Because I do believe in a world to come, and in the Olam Haba, in my Olam Haba, my day of judgment is going to be balanced in the merit of my behaviors one way or the other, right? And I would just reinterpret that with our modern understanding of Olam Haba too. Olam Haba is not some other world. It's not some cosmic alternate reality that we enter into once we pass on. That's a possibility, but I don't know about that. But I do know that this understanding of Olam Haba makes a lot of sense to me. Olam Haba is the next moment right in front of me. Every moment right in front of me is Olam Haba. It is the world to come. It is the future. And if I can understand Olam Haba as being something that I can have influence on, my behavior matters in such a way that the Olam Haba, the next world that I create, the future that I create is impacted by that. That also would remind me that my mitzvot, my good deeds matter. Okay. Nice. Thank you, by the way. And yeah, thank you for all your contributions there, Joy, as well. All right, let me go back to the text and let's read the next one. Okay, so let's go because I want to get to the meaty stuff at the end. Okay, the second text that we're going to be looking at is taken from the Teshuvah. This is the response crafted by Rabbi Joel Rembam in the, I believe it's the late 1980s, okay, regarding the inclusion of the names of the matriarchs in the blessing of the Amidah, okay? So he is now going to be giving us the rationale for why it is permissible and even necessary for us to add a prayer. We dealt with reinterpretation with Marsha Fogg, and now we are dealing with the concept of adding prayers, which is what Rabbi Joel Rembam, who was at the time the senior rabbi of Temple Beth Am in Los Angeles, and one of the premier flagship congregations of the conservative movement, and there they were making the adjustment in their prayer expression to include the imahot, and they wanted to do so legally. So here he writes, I've investigated a number of halakhic sources noted below, and I've come to the conclusion that such a change is warranted. So the first thing, this is actually early on in the whole writing, and I didn't bring the whole thing because it takes lots and lots of time. Very interesting, but it takes lots and lots of time. But what he says is that after all my study, change is warranted, okay? He could have said after all my study, no, nobody's ever made the change before, and that makes my decision to sort of break rank or to break tradition all the more so difficult. He says, no, this is warranted. While remaining within a framework established in Talmudic times, Jewish liturgy has retained a flexibility that has allowed it to be adjusted and adapted to the spiritual needs of different generations of Jews, okay? So he's basically surmising that even since Talmudic times, the Siddur wasn't codified like a Sefer Torah. The rabbis never said, you can't change letters of the Torah, like they said about letters of the Siddur, like they said about the Torah, because there were all kinds of adaptations, let alone the Talmud itself. And we've studied this before. The Talmud has examples all over the place, sometimes contradictory examples of what one should say in a certain circumstance. So the idea that we pray and adapt our prayers to our needs in the specific generation is well proven from previous generations. A survey of various versions of the Amidah reveals that in early post-Talmudic period, the wording of a number of the blessings of the Amidah were considerably different from the language that eventually became Saturnized in the later Geonic period. Okay, I can't remember if we studied this in our class, but we did talk about the middle blessings of the Amidah, and we talked about the idea that they added one. It was called the Shmona Esrei, and they really are, Shmona Esrei in Hebrew means 18, but there really are 19 prayers, and that's because one of them was inserted initially. Now that insertion is old, but the adaptation of what it was actually evolved over many years. including other prayers like Yizkor. Let's just take Yizkor, for example. Yizkor, you would say, oh my God, they were saying it since the time of Mount Sinai. They were remembering, the passing of all of our loved ones and these great holy moments at the holidays. No, it's early showed up in the Middle Ages, and it really wasn't codified until like the 17th century. So just to give you a sense, things change, okay? Hold on to that, because just because things have changed in the past doesn't mean we should change things now, right? The reader is referred to a fragment even from the Cairo Geniza. By the way, Cairo Geniza is about, again, it's like 1,500 years old, 1,800 years old. Especially striking is the language of the 13th blessing, not right on that time. 13th blessing, with its emphasis on the righteous converts and the absence of references to the other categories of righteous individuals found later in the later texts. So in other words, right, in the blessings of the Amidah, we see even alternative forms. And the Cairo Geniza is, a much later time in history, hundreds of years after the time that they wrote this in the Talmud, generations later, and they were making changes. Now, he concludes, the inclusion of the names of the matriarchs in the blessing is consistent with the traditions of the Bible, normative Jewish theology, and the theme of the first paragraph of the Amidah. In the Genesis accounts, the matriarchs function as significant factors in the unfolding of the covenant between God and the Israelite nation. As I mentioned in my introduction to this, it's the same issue. For us to exclude the matriarchs because the sociological experience of community at the time that the original prayers were written was a predominantly male-driven society, and that men were the ones who engaged in learning and commerce, and women were back home as the caretakers of the home. At best, sometimes they were even worse. They were just, merely vessels for procreation. That all of a sudden, that transformed. I mean, it's been transforming since, certainly the 20th century. And all the more so now we live in a time, I mean, well, my wife's a rabbi, and it's not because I bring it not because they think that that's unique. I bring it because I'm growing up in a world where there is no distinction between our genders and the roles that we play. And I mean that, right? I mean, I do the dishes and she does the dishes. I take out the trash. She does not. But she sometimes brings the trash cans in. That's fair. Nonetheless, the matriarchs have a place because they also had a very, very significant role. We need to be rewriting back into our books the story of Sarah. We need to be rewriting back into our prayer books the story of Rebecca and of Rachel and of Leah. And we do the Midrash. There's so many texts that have been accumulated over the years that are beautiful treasures of understanding about our relationship with God that come from the voices and the figures of women. And for us to exclude them because they had no place in the Beit Midrash at the time is our failure. So therefore, in the 20th century, we had to say, no, make a change. So he concludes, and then I'll stop. The blessing functions as an affirmation of the covenantal bond between God and his people, and given the matriarch's role in the development of that relationship, allusion to them in this blessing is most appropriate. Jewish tradition already has recognized within the liturgy the significance of the matriarchal role in the selection of the account of God's remembering Sarah as a Torah reading for the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Continuing in this vein, the Hebrew got cut out. Continuing in this vein, the addition of the term to the conclusion of the blessing is an important reinforcement to a prayer that highlights this unique covenantal bond. In other words, I mean, it's beautiful, right? He basically says, we have plenty of examples throughout history of prayers changing. So the idea that we include the matriarchs here isn't sort of a new-founded idea. It's not just this, it's not a feminist apology for why we need to include women in our prayers. It's the affirmation of what's already true. The role of women and the significance of women in our liturgy is equally and uniquely relevant and pertinent to our connection with God. And that's why we refer with the language that's been constructed to the God of Sarah, the God of Rebecca, the God of Rachel, the God of Leah. All of those things are the ones that we use for us to begin our very same grounding that we do with our patriarchs, which is to say we're about to talk to God from our own space. And we're talking to God from the space of our patriarchs and all of their noble virtues, and our matriarchs and all of their noble virtues. And the idea is it's not one superior to another. They coalesce. They represent one universal purpose, which is me having the privilege to present myself before God and express myself and be heard. Okay. Let me pause, see if anybody has anything to add. So let's see. Joy says, books by Savina Tebul, Zichrona Livracha, Sarah and Hagar, I have not, but Joy is recommending a book by Savina Tuval, okay? And that's nice, let's see. Don't see if I can't get all of the quotes. How come it's not giving me more? Oh, you guys are great. Okay, thank you, Suzanne. Let me see if I got a better. Here we go. Ha, okay. Right, even during the writing of the Torah, says Suzanne, which is where we find the most domination of women. Okay, right, in other words, it's wonderful, right? We could say, I mean, that's another conversation, but we could say the Torah, even in of itself, is written with a certain kind of patriarchy to it and prevents the voice of women, right? And certainly there have been attempts to sort of rewrite the Torah or reread parts of the Torah in order to include the voice of women. I would say for tonight, our discussion is not whether or not we need to amend the Torah. That there is a place for that. There is another conversation to be had about that, and what that looks like in the minds of the rabbinic tradition and the minds of modernity is something that's worthy of another conversation. Tonight, we're just dealing specifically with the prayer language and why we needed to make the addition, because we need to understand that our prayer language is something that has to reflect our experience. It's me praying. It's not my ancestors praying. It's not your ancestors praying. It's me praying. And because that is true, then I need to be able to say it in language and with words and with concepts that mean the most to me. Okay. All right. So are you ready for the last one? I'm thrilled. So I love this book. I'm going to highly recommend it one more time. Okay. And I'm doing that, by the way. Okay. Thank you, Mark. You like my concept of Olam Haba. And I wish I could take full credit, but I really do learn from my teacher, Ira Stone, on that. It's the unmanifested moment to come. Yes, it's like Ehyeh, absolutely, right? It's what will be, I will be, I will be, right? What does God tell Moses to tell the Israelite people? Ehyeh, right? And the people get it. I mean, I love it. Right? I'm going to smack my desk down to say that they get it because they know that what they're talking about in their slavery and in their oppression and their despair, Ehyeh is coming. Hope, future, change, Olam Haba. And the moment that Moses gives it to them with their a little bit of their ambivalence with it, but ultimately through the plagues and the signs, they see that God is for real. Ehyeh appears, right? So what I wanted to say is I really like this book. This whole series, okay? This is called My People's Prayer Book, and it is edited by Rabbi Larry Hoffman. And this is the volume 6, which had to do with the Aleinu prayer and Tachanun. And it is where we find our text from Ellen Frankel, who was the longtime publisher of Jewish Publication Society, and then she has her own publications. So here she writes, I love this, okay? Many contemporary American Jews find the first paragraph of this prayer, now we're back in the Aleinu, very difficult, even as they find the second one welcome, right? So the first paragraph is, we're unique and God gives us a unique destiny and therefore we bow to God. And this, part of the prayer that was excised, which said that, everybody else was Hevel and Rake and they believe in a God that doesn't save, but you God save, right? All of that stuff in the first paragraph is so distasteful to us. But the second paragraph is, L'taken olam b'malchut shaddai, that we should see the day in which the world is perfected with God's presence, and that every knee bows, and that every lip utters praise, and that we're all in that place. And on that day, God's name will be one. And just like Mark taught us, everything is one. And when everything is one, you and me and the world and the cosmos, we're all one. That's a sort of sense of the world as we hoped it would be and ought to be. And I got to say, I believe it. I recognize that there are challenges to that. I recognize that the reality doesn't reflect that, but it's something that makes me a prayerful person, right? Striving to one. So she writes, many contemporary American Jews find the first paragraph of this prayer difficult, even as they find the second one welcome. The difficult part of the Eleino's emphasis on the essential dividedness of the world, the tribalism of its peoples, the separateness of its families, and rather than lament this estrangement, we are asked to declare our gratitude that this is the way things are and to celebrate that our lot is not like that of the multitudes, right? So we are talking about the fact that there is division in the world, and while we recognize the division of the world, we're special, okay? So much so that we would even say we're more special than everyone else who doesn't even believe in you, okay? An older version of this prayer offered that rationalization for this triumphalist stance, for they bow down to vanity and emptiness and pray to a God who does not save. Whereas we bend the knee and bow in acknowledgement to the one true God. In this modern multiculturalist world in which we live, we can no longer allow ourselves such arrogance. We may acknowledge our difference without privileging it. So before we get to the last part, which I also cut out a little bit of her piece, but I wanted to sort of, emphasize what I think is going on here. Okay, this is a part of the prayer. There are prayers that have changed over time. So in the morning blessings, I think we sort of touched on it when we talked about the morning blessings, where it says, Shelo asani isha, Shelo asani eved, Shelo asani goy. That God didn't make me a woman, that God didn't make me a slave, and that God didn't make me a non-Jew, right? And those have all been recast in modern language, okay? Some Sidurim hold them because they believe that the Sidur is like the Sefer Torah, or they've sort of developed a theology that rationalizes that. But for most modernists, all of us who live in this time and age, these are just words that we cannot say. Like I have never in my life ever uttered the words Shelo asani isha in the prayer, other than to just say those words. And the same thing with this Aleinu prayer. We took out that line because there was something there that just said it was so completely beyond the pale of what we were hoping or intending to express in that statement that we needed to take it out. Now, what Frankel writes, Ellen Frankel writes, which is so powerful, is that she recognizes that the Jews are ones that have suffered and have been victimized and have been marginalized and isolated and divided because of their unique status. Sometimes our uniqueness has been defined by others rather than defined by ourselves. So the recitation of this prayer is quite triumphalist, is to say, yeah, you separate us, but we're separated for a higher purpose, right? This is the idea that we have some kind of exceptional responsibility. We are chosen among all other nations to fulfill a destiny because you have rejected us. And there's something very confirming about that. Psychologically, it's a defense mechanism, but it's a legitimate defense mechanism. And then just to heap on another layer of this, which is that we're living in the generation that is post-Holocaust. And we talk about marginalization, degradation, horrific massacres, and extermination of millions of our people. The traumas of that are still lingering. And in those traumas, on the one hand, we have a bit of concern, preservationist concern. We don't want to change anything that we have because we're the ones that survived, and we're not changing anything that was given to us from those who came before us, because they died, they suffered, and we respect them. We lift them up, we glorify them because of their suffering. And so therefore we protect all of the prayers. And then there's this other one that says, it's hard. Even the praying Jew in that moment who survived used those words. So those words must have worked then. So that means that they must work now. And the idea that we inherit words from those who precede us as words that worked for whatever working means. And by the way, that's next week's session. Do prayers work? How do prayers work? That the reason that we don't change them is because they work for them, so they must be good enough for us. And then you get this wonderful sort of conclusion, which Ellen Frankel writes. I love it. She says, Aleinu thus has incredible power to transform our own lives, not just our world. In other words, the prayer that signals the end of the services that demands we make a new beginning demands that we make a new beginning when we leave the synagogue. In other words, Aleinu comes at the end of our prayer service because it's a clarion call. It's a rising anthem. It's a challenge to lift ourselves up from the doldrums and the dust piles of our humble existence, and to, with renewed strength, with a sense of uniqueness and particularity, not diminishing the universal aspect of our relation to all humanity in the world, but like recognizing that we have a special responsibility to go out the world and make a change, to make a new beginning. That's what we do in the middle of our prayers, and that is a rousing chorus at the end of it. Forget the melody, right? Forget the fact that you hear Aleinu and the rabbi goes up like this and you're like, oh, well, that means it's time for Kiddush. No. All those things, those are sort of ancillary outcomes of the ultimate prayer. The ultimate prayer is we're done, and now go out and make a difference. Go out and be the change in the world that you've just prayed about. So for those who am learning in other places, right? There's a wonderful folk saying, right? It says, pray as if everything depends on God and act as if everything depends on you. Right? So that's just a wonderful folk saying, and you've heard it before. This applies here as well, right? You pray as if everything depends on God. God is going to be the one that helps us come all together. But unless you go out the door and you're the one who is responsible for bringing that action into being, well then, at least as Ellen Frankel writes as well, and I didn't include it, well then we're just like those vain and empty people who pray to a God that cannot save. Okay? So Suzanne, thank you. I love it. You grab the Reform Siddur. So you see, it's not, they didn't take it out. They just they reformatted it. They reworded it. I'm having a hard time getting the see more of what you said. Oh, they're giving us a destiny unique among the nations. Uniqueness, separation, right? It's not, so basically it's that concept that we are there to contribute. And by contributing to the world, we are fulfilling a unique destiny, okay? And I think that idea is beautiful. By the way, if anybody else has any more comments to add before we conclude, go ahead and add them, because we are gonna reach our conclusion. This to me is exactly what we do with prayers that we don't agree with, okay? Sometimes we have to take the prayers out, and sometimes we have to reinterpret the prayers, and sometimes we have to add to our prayers, okay? You have permission. You have a responsibility to make your prayer purposeful. It's not me who makes sure that you're praying correctly. It's you who has the heroic and courageous effort to walk into a synagogue and say, I'm going to talk to whatever I define to be God in that moment. And I'm going to do it with people that care and trust me, and then I can trust them, because I'm about to say some pretty vulnerable stuff. It's about me vulnerable. It's about the world that I live in that's vulnerable, and I need some help. And to be able to do that, you have to say it like you mean it. And you can't say words that you don't mean, right? That's what Marcia Falk says. Words get inappropriate, get rid of them. Words that you don't understand, maybe you need to reinterpret them before you get rid of them. And words that sometimes are missing something that's so important, well, then our tradition teaches us that we have every right, we're even inspired and encouraged, compelled to add those prayers to. So I wonder what it would be like for you to write your own prayer if you're struggling with a paragraph. So if there's something that you're struggling with, find that piece of that prayer and rewrite it into words that you think make sense to you. And if you can't do it, well then first of all, maybe find a friend, a learning partner, right? Send it to me. I would be happy to look at it. Or maybe you can put it aside and try to figure out, like, what does it mean to pray without that and experience that? Because maybe in that journey of praying without it, you realize that there was something that was being said that's missing. And it is important to reincorporate that. And if you reincorporate that, then you would have a more full prayer experience. Finally, the same thing would be true about removing prayers. There are some times when the things that we say are just not meant to be said anymore. And that's okay to take them out. And finding those words and exploring what words need to be taken out and adopting words that have some kind of communal resonance or some kind of continuity that exists beyond you, whether it's in your present generation or for the future generation, well, that's a very worthy endeavor. Imagine being able to write words into the future. Olam haba. I hope that whatever words that you write into the future, they are the words just like the second paragraph Shema. They bring an abundance of blessing, abundance of food and grain and wine and oil so that you eat and you are satisfied. Imagine being able to create words and create ideas and connect in that way, and to be able to eat and be satisfied with the prayers that you express. Come back next week. Next week, we're going to talk about how do we make some meaning out of these prayers? Okay? How do we apply this and make some new meaning? And then that will bring us to eventually a conclusion of our learning. And we're going to actually bring our conclusion of this class and ask the great question of why pray again. Okay, so thanks so much for joining. I'm so happy to have you all here. Thank you for your contributions, and I wish you all a wonderful, wonderful week. We'll see you next week. Take care.